Calumet Editions, an eclectic publisher of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, introduced a new business model nearly a decade ago, in which the publisher and author work as equal partners in a joint venture. Their stable of authors have won numerous and prestigious prizes across literary forums. Where traditional publishers fail to see the value in projects, Calumet cooperates with its authors in realizing a book's potential.
Hello everyone, I'm Josh Weber. I'll be guest hosting this episode of Writer's Corner. Today I'm joined by two authors, Gary Lindberg and ELLIOTT Foster, to discuss their approaches to writing genre thrillers and also celebrating Pride Month. As a writer and film producer / director, Gary Lindberg has won over 100 major national and international awards. He's the author of 4 Amazon #1 best-selling novels, including The Chicano Legacy, one of the most popular Kindle thrillers on Amazon in 2011. And 3 books about the unknown history of Elvis Presley. On my left, ELLIOTT Foster is the award-winning author of Panic River, Reckoning Waves, and Destiny Springs. Panic River is the first volume in a trilogy following Reckoning Waves, which won Best Gay Fiction at the 2022 San Francisco Book Festival. The third volume of the trilogy, Destiny Springs, was released earlier this year. ELLIOTT's other works include Retrieving Isaac and Jason and Whispering Pines, Tales from a Northwoods Cabin, a 2016 Indies Next finalist for Best Fiction. ELLIOTT's short stories, poems, and essays have been published in a variety of journals and other media. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So, relationships in both of your works are pivotal to plot. How did you both develop these relationships to reflect real-life complexities? Gary, why don't you start?
Well, in my thrillers, which are long, complex, plot-driven stories, I have an abundance of characters, so I have lots of opportunities for relationships. Some of them nefarious, some of them warm and loving, some of them combative. The way I start is by getting to know my characters. Authors generally understand what I mean when I say getting to know my characters. I get to know my characters by writing about them, by thinking about how they would talk. Once I get to know the characters, then I find it very interesting to put them into scenes with other characters that I've invented to see how they respond. And very often I'll write a scene 3 or 4 times because I don't believe the way the character is responding. So the characters start to talk to me. They start to achieve a kind of a life of their own and a personality of their own. Sometimes they do things I don't want them to do. They need to be spanked. But I find that the characters, that's how I work to get characters to become a little bit more 3-dimensional rather than just surrogates to serve the plot. And this is the problem with any kind of genre thriller format, is that the stories are usually so plot-driven that there isn't much room to explore the characters themselves. But plot can derive from character development. When characters expose themselves, they suggest places for the plot to go that sometimes are unexpected.
Then ELLIOTT, how do you delve into the psychological aspects of your characters to create what Gary says, these multi-dimensional individuals? Does it take time for you to familiarize yourself with these individuals, to feel some kinship with them, and then they develop the plot?
Yeah, definitely. What Gary said really resonates, that even though this trilogy I wrote, culminating in Destiny Springs, is thriller and suspense, and it has those elements that drive the story, really these stories are also about relationships. And so the protagonist, of course, is someone you want to have a character arc for and develop. But I found it was really important to do that, not just through his experience with these suspense or thriller elements, but with the other characters. So relationship with the protagonist's mother, with his best friend, with his ex-lover. And I think during the same time, the way at least I worked through the protagonist's growth was also having growth, sometimes setbacks, but overall growth for the other characters as well, which made it even more multidimensional, almost like a Rubik's Cube for people who remember that toy, where you're shifting one character and it affects the protagonist and the other characters, and they have to respond to each other. So it was challenging, but that's how I work through it.
Well, I want to dive a little more into this. In Destiny Springs, how did you approach the emotional evolution of Corey, especially considering his traumatic experience and the impact on his relationships?
Yeah, I think for him, it really was about what I mentioned, the interaction with other characters, primarily his mother. So Corey and his mother, she was part of, or at least witness to, his childhood traumas that you reference. And then as Corey ages and as she ages, she changes and she sees him in a different light and she reacts to him in a different light, which I think then he's not used to because he was used to a very silent mother in this particular, setup. But as she became more vocal and she grew and was more empathetic, that affected how he reacted as well.
How do both of you engage readers emotionally with your characters and their journeys? Gary?
I tend to think of my characters as people that I know. In the Shekinah Legacy, the two main characters are a mother who is a news journalist for a cable news outlet I call CCN. I think you can figure out which one that is. She is the Christiane Amanpour international reporter. She's married to an Iranian, and she has a son who's 13 years old who has Asperger's. And a mother who left the family a long time ago. And these were all people who I knew in one sense or another. They developed their own personalities, so they're no longer familiar to me. They became very different people as they matured through my stories. But it was easier for me to imagine the relationships they were having with each other because I was seeing those same relationships reflected in the lives of people I knew. And so I was able to reflect those as an author. I think one of the jobs of an author is to be a good observer, is to observe how people exhibit their relationships through their words and their actions. And so that's what I do, is I try to observe other people and I borrow from their experiences and their behaviors and put them into my stories.
Elliott?
Yeah, I would echo what Gary said too. I think in my stories, this trilogy, Corey, the main protagonist, is very much a dweller and a thinker. And so I think it's hard for his character to break out of that pattern or grow without external influences. So I use those a lot as far as, other characters who are mean or nice to him, tragedies that happen to him. So external influences that I think trigger the emotion for the reader and the growth for the character.
How do you balance internal character struggles with external plot-driven conflicts? I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that, especially with Corey's character.
So this is something I've had to learn a lot, and I've hopefully grown at as a writer, because I didn't start out knowing how to do this. But it's a real delicate balance between the internal growth of whatever character, certainly the protagonist, and these external influences, and making sure they sound right. So I do a lot of, after I initially write something, I read it out loud, I rethink about it, I have other people look at it to make sure, as Gary said, that they're real and that this is authentic, that it's just not something strange, that the character does something very out of the ordinary or unexpected in a way that's not believable. So I think correcting any tendencies toward that is the technique I've used.
Same question, Gary. How do you balance internal struggles with character struggles with plot-driven conflicts that are external? Because your case, there's chase scenes, there's action set pieces going through the work.
In a high body count. Because it's an action, the first two books were action-adventure thrillers, so there was a lot of action. But I've learned, because I come from the film industry, the motion picture industry, I learned that the essence of drama usually does derive from the characters themselves. And if the characters, if the audience doesn't feel there's something at stake for the characters, it doesn't matter. It's just a bunch of flying around and hitting people in the face and shooting bullets, and it's just empty fodder for the eyes. So there has to be something for them to grab onto that relates to the humanity of the characters, even the villains. The thing I despise in most mysteries and thrillers these days is the bad guys who are only bad.
Right.
who have no redeeming qualities and are just evil. You know, they're out to blow up the world or something. And there's, you know, everybody has some dimensions to them, even villains. And so I particularly like working on the villains in my stories. And sometimes I even get confused about which of the characters are villains or not, because there's many shades of gray in terms of how people perceive the righteousness of their actions. And that's part of what my books are about.
Well, I'm curious now, then, have you ever been spooked by how you've agreed with sometimes the villain's motivations when you developed it well enough?
Yes, in my first novel, The Shekinah Legacy, it involves an ancient band of assassins, which derived from the Sicarii, the Jews who followed the death of Jesus. And some of them became zealots, some of them became assassins. And in my world that I built, these assassins never stopped being assassins. They didn't die off. They continued and became professionalized. And they see themselves as the good guys, the garbage collectors of society. So this is a good example of how this works. And I tried to portray them as being of service to justice as they see it. Because I think this also helps define what we see in the world of terrorism and everything else. Most people who are doing bad deeds think they're serving some greater good purpose. And so it's very difficult, and I set it as a challenge for myself, to develop assassins who you actually liked and sometimes agreed with, that the guy they were assigned to assassin really should be put out of society's misery. And I found myself agreeing in some cases. In this case, they actually would have elections in terms of which people would be assassinated. And they had arguments, grand arguments about, did this person really deserve to be killed?
Destiny Springs also explores themes of justice and vengeance through Cecilia's character. How do you balance these themes to ensure they complement rather than overshadow the story?
Yeah, great question. I think I'll combine it with a little reaction to what Gary said, in that, you know, rather than me so much focusing on the villains, which I did try to make multidimensional, I really had the main character, and it's not giving anything away, but in the very first book, Panic River, he kills someone accidentally, and what drives the rest of the trilogy and much of the suspense and thriller is him figuring out, am I a bad person or not, but then also the justice and vengeance that you reference, because one of the living victims of his crime, if you will, or his accidental killing, is chasing him then for the next two books. And I think it's intertwined, so as far as balancing that, clearly the chase, the search for justice and vengeance, and what it means to see justice or what it will look like, drives the plot, but it also drives the character development of Corey, the protagonist, certainly Cecilia, who's chasing him, and it affects the other secondary characters as well. So I don't know if I have a magic answer how do I balance it, but it's all intertwined.
Shekinah Legacy explores themes of justice and corruption. Gary, this makes me wonder, how do you weave these themes into your narrative without being didactic?
Yeah, I wish I had a simple answer for that. Just like Elliott, you know, we as authors struggle with all of these things, trying to find that delicate balance between good and bad, between justice, between action and introspection. It's very, very difficult. And with thrillers, the challenge is even greater, because thrillers are like mysteries jacked up a little bit more on steroids. And so things are a little bit bigger than life. Elliott's books are more real life than my books, which are more over the top. But they all hint, both of us write based on the characters themselves. And I think sometimes we get in our way about worrying too much about plot versus character, because to me, they're like two sides of the same coin. Plots don't work at all if you don't have strong characters. But characters without some sort of driving force that moves them through history, through the story, which is plot, don't work either. They become very dull for people to read. My partner in our publishing company, Calumet Editions, Ian Graham Leask, writes literary novels. I write genre thrillers and things. So we're in different camps. And I always tease him that a lot of people think that literary fiction is where you read the story and you learn a lot about the character, but nothing really happens. And with a thriller, people read it, they don't learn much about the characters, but a lot of stuff is happening all around them. And so what both Elliott and I think, are saying we're trying to do with our thrillers structure is to combine the two in some alchemical way to actually provide both elements for the reader.
So now, on top of that, settings in both of your novels play a significant role in shaping the narrative. How do you select and describe settings to enhance the story's atmosphere? Elliott?
Yeah, setting was really important for me. So all three books take place in basically three different places in each book. A cabin in northern Wisconsin, I needed the woods, and I needed a deer hunting scene, and sometimes woods convey that moody or mysterious element, and that was intentional. The second setting is in the greater Minneapolis area, where I just needed a little more cosmopolitan flair to the characters and their current lives. And then the third setting, which appears again in all three books, is set in Southern California, which is kind of that stereotypical, the West. It's hopeful, that's where maybe the solution is, and brighter days. And as you can probably guess, in the three books, the main character goes back and forth between these settings because he sees hope. He gets drawn back to this moodiness, this sense of danger in the woods. So I've used those settings for those reasons.
Gary?
Yeah, well, my first thriller, The Shekinah Legacy, takes place all over the globe. It begins in Iraq. It moves to Minneapolis, the Lake Minnetonka area, then moves to India, and then the characters are transplanted into Kashmir, where discoveries are made. And I didn't know much about India and Kashmir. I knew a lot about the Minnetonka area. I didn't want to go to Iraq during this period because we were fighting. So I took a trip around the world. I visited my daughter for a week and a half in Singapore, and then we went to India, and I traveled through India. I went to Kashmir, which the State Department said we shouldn't go to because the Pakistanis and the Indians are fighting over that terrain. But it was an important setting in my plot. So I took careful notes, a lot of photographs, which had the GPS coordinates on them. And what I tried to do is use my personal experience in these locations as settings for my story. So I didn't make them up. So I used the actual place name of streets and hotels. And I could see them in my mind as I was writing because I felt that would give the story a little more authenticity. It was easy to do for the Lake Minnetonka area because I grew up in Twin Cities. But I actually, some of the plot points and the character development were suggested by people I met in these various locations, Indians and Kashmiris. And they became characters in my book because I got to know them, and it was easy to simply put them in there and imagine how they would respond to me.
Gary, your narrative often shifts between different characters' perspectives. How do you maintain a consistent voice while ensuring each character's individuality is preserved? Yeah,
well, you have several different things. It depends on what point of view you're using in writing. In a third person narrative, it's the author speaking. And there's various levels that you can use. You can be godlike and omniscient, or you can limit yourself to only what a particular character knows. So what I do is I divide the story into points of view. I try not to depart from a point of view of a scene, a dominant point of view. So I play the role of that character, and I explore that character's thoughts, but I don't jump from that character into somebody else's head during the same scene. So that's a way of providing some continuity. So I don't want the reader to ever be confused as to whose point of view they're reading this scene from. So that's one of the techniques that I use.
Yeah, I used it a little bit, that shifting perspective in the different books. So Panic River is definitely close third person throughout because it's very focused on Corey, the protagonist's thoughts and introspection, and of course his actions. But as I mentioned earlier, with the development of the other relationships with secondary characters and their development, I pulled back a little bit on Reckoning Waves, and then in Destiny Springs, it's still third person, but it's told a little bit more like what Gary's saying from different perspectives, because in order to really capture what Jenny, his mother, is about or what she's thinking, I can't tell that through Corey's perspective. No. So it was a broadening of the lens as the books progressed.
Elliott, how do you navigate the moral ambiguities of your characters, particularly with Cecilia and Corey, to add depth to the story?
This was also something I had to learn along the way, because I probably went into these books thinking, there's good and evil and the person's good or bad. And as we talked about earlier, that's not always true in our personal lives and shouldn't be true in the characters. So it really took me to think before writing, or to write and then rethink and rewrite with, Cecilia in particular, because she's the aggrieved widow of someone that Corey killed. And so she's got definitely a drive for vengeance, and she's a character who will at all costs try to achieve that. But, rather than just make her very one-dimensional, she's crazy and she is, venturing into evil, I brought in like her daughter as a character who softens her and shows that she's also a mother and she loves her husband. And so there are, it's more complicated. So it was balancing those factors.
The pacing of thrillers is really critical to maintain suspense. Elliott, what techniques have either of you employed to keep readers on the edge? Elliott, first.
I think giving spoonfuls of information, and this is something that has to be learned and redrafted, to make sure that you're not giving too much, but you're at least giving something in each scene so that it's driving the story forward. So I've tried to be very conscious about what, especially Cecilia, the character is pursuing the protagonist, what she learns or what she does in bits and drips and drabs along the story.
Yeah, what I found is my thrillers have become more like film scripts with intercutting between scenes. Instead of longer scenes where people are talking or doing something, I intercut between a bit of action that's going here, where you have a sense that the action is going to end up with some sort of climax. So it's building suspense, and at the same time you can have a longer conversation going on in a room. In Shekinah Legacy, I have a scholar who is giving a lesson to a group who is on the run about material he understands from an ancient manuscript which could help solve this big mystery. And while he's talking, I never let him talk for more than a minute or so without cutting to drama that was occurring outside of the building he was in that was going to lead up to some sort of disaster. So you were feeling suspense building while you were still getting all of this exposition taking place. So it was intercutting quickly between two different scenes that were all moving towards the same conclusion.
Thrillers often rely on these unexpected twists. Gary, how do you craft plot twists that surprise yet remain plausible?
Well, my secret technique, which I'm going to now expose for the first time to the world in this interview, is the most successfully I've done this has been when I've surprised myself. In other words, sometimes I find myself painting myself into a corner where I know that a character is going to end up in a very difficult situation which would possibly lead to his death. But I can't lose the character, so he has to find a way out of it. And very often I don't know how he's going to get out of it. So I write myself into these narrow escapes. And then I have to figure out myself. Of course, I allow myself more time than the character has, but I figure out how he's going to do it. And that usually ends up with it ends up as a plot twist. And sometimes I find myself having to go back and plant something that the character can use to get out of it that wasn't in the scene before. But I find myself, the more I can surprise myself in the writing of these drafts, the better it works for the reader.
We are very close to being done here, but I wanted to ask both of you one more question. How do you ensure that your novel's ending provides closure while leaving room for readers' interpretations?
I guess I would say I can reveal a secret too. I have a very good literary coach and editor. You mentioned Ian Graham-Leach, so someone who tests you and pushes you to make sure you're closing those stories. But with that prompt, I guess I really think through, where is the character journey? Has it finished its arc? Are the relationships resolved to a point where it's satisfying for a reader? And just apply that test to what you're writing.
Mr. Lindberg.
In a big 140,000 word complex thriller like the Shekinah Legacy, where you have dozens of characters, all who have their own character arcs and need closure, that's a very difficult challenge. You can't do it all at once. You have to wind up some of those character arcs earlier in the story, otherwise you end up with a Charlie Chan sitting in the Inspector Clouseau solving the mystery for everybody, which is never satisfying. So in the Shekinah Legacy, I did it in the simplest possible way. I actually end the book with the character learning the solution to the great mystery which we've been trying to solve, but I don't reveal it. And I was scared to death that readers would hate that, not having that resolution.
What was the reader's response?
It was mostly positive. Some people hit me over the head and said, you took the easy way out. But most of them said, yeah, this seemed to be the only way you could actually end it. And but they all chose a different ending for themselves, which is perfectly all right.
The only way to end this show is by ending it now. So everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to Writer's Corner. I have a special guest hosting this time. I'm Josh Weber, joined by Gary Lindberg and ELLIOTT Foster. Thank you so much.